They're still there because I suspect they've seen common sense that it doesn't make sense to walk away when you're in discussion still.
Matthew, will people who voted for him to deliver Brexit cut him some slack over the fact that he's missed the deadline that he set himself?
I don't personally think voters will mind about the deadline being missed, but they will mind if we don't meet that December deadline. As we know, Joe, Boris Johnson has effectively realigned the Conservative Party electorate. It's much more Levy than it was under Theresa May even, never mind David Cameron. So for these voters, they really are holding Boris Johnson on this Brexit question, which he has to deliver on.
Sonia, do people really care as much about Brexit and deadlines when we're in the middle of a pandemic?
It does really feel like the salience of Brexit has gone down as an issue, and little wonder when you see what's going on in areas of the country like Liverpool. I think for me, the whole story of Brexit has been one of the government drawing firm red lines in the sand that it says it's never going to cross, and then sort of stepping over them and claiming a massive victory. But for me, the real story, I think, about Brexit is the really damaging economic consequences that the government's own forecasts say even the sort of bare bones free trade agreement that Boris Johnson is shooting for will have on the country. And that is going to have a big impact on British businesses and British jobs at a time where the economy is struggling in a way that it hasn't ever done before. And I think that is really going to, coming on top of the pandemic, it's going to be a huge, huge problem for British businesses and for people in jobs.
Just briefly before we move on, do you want to respond to that?
I think Brexit remains a key issue, and I agree with Matthew. Those people who voted Conservative for the first time in December because they believed in Brexit and they were repulsed, frankly, by a position of the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats Party, which simply wanted to cancel that 2016 referendum result. It's vitally important we honour that result, but in a proper way, and we get a Brexit deal that enables us to take control of our borders, our money and our laws. And I believe that we can still get that.
I said it was all oven ready, and we now see that they're having to delay it further again. I think that some broken promises have come along the way.
All right, we're going to move on because COVID is certainly the most important story today because we have had announcements. The Health Secretary, Matthew Hancock, has been in the House of Commons. Tighter restrictions in London. We're going to talk to our political editor, BBC London, Tim Donovan, and also talks are ongoing in Greater Manchester, and in a moment we'll talk to Helen Pidd, who is the North of England editor for The Guardian. First of all, Tim, tell us what's changing in London from midnight tomorrow night.
London's moving to Tier 2. I think the public health officials from London made a pretty strong case at this Gold Committee yesterday because the figures have been moving in the wrong direction for some time, and there's been a speculation now for several days that something needed to happen. Everyone's been focusing a little bit on this rate of 100 cases per 100,000 population, and that has been creeping up very close to that as of today, and nearly half of London's 33 boroughs are now above that rate. So the pressure had been building, and Matt Hancock had discussions with London council leaders and with the Mayor of London, indicating the steps he was going to take. As we heard in the House of Commons, he says that cases in the capital, while they are much lower than elsewhere in the country at the moment, are doubling every 10 days and on a very steep trajectory. So the one thing that London council leaders and the Mayor really want resolved here, and there was a lot of pushback, I'm told, from Tory MPs as well, who didn't feel that there should be a London-wide restriction or move to these measures imposed. Really keen to see a clear exit route out of this now, if it's going to happen. What does it need to take to come out of these restrictions? And of course, as we know, there are concerns about how this will impact particularly the hospitality sector, and at the moment the centre of London, the West End, is being wasted financially, and there are real concerns there. So the Mayor has been pushing for that and for more cash for local authorities. I'm told Robert Jenrick was on the call with London Council leaders today, though, saying, hang on a second, we gave you £1 billion more countrywide last week. You're going to be getting in London about 100 million pounds of that to help.
Tim Donovan there, thank you very much. Well, the Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, had been pushing, as Tim was saying, for this for a while. There hasn't been agreement reached yet in Greater Manchester. Helen, what's going on exactly?
Well, basically, there's the Greater Manchester MPs, a third of whom are actually Conservative MPs, formed a pretty strong alliance today and made it very clear to government on their call with the Care Minister, Helen Whately, that they would not accept Tier 3. And the same was true on another call with Greater Manchester's local leaders. Their meeting apparently began with government saying, you know, you can either come with us or we'll impose it anyway, which went down appallingly. It's the Tory MPs in Greater Manchester who seem to be really leading the charge against Tier 3 restrictions. They largely come at it from a kind of libertarian point of view, and they don't like anything which restricts freedoms. Whereas for Greater Manchester's Labour leaders and the MPs, it's much more about supporting the most vulnerable in society. And they say that the offer of support in place for Tier 3, which offers to pay only 2/3 of the wages of hospitality workers if their pubs are forced to close, is just not good enough, because it means you've got the lowest paid workers who are already on the minimum wage earning just over £5 an hour, and they won't be able to pay their bills. So if government thought that it was going to be an easy ride, and I doubt they did think that, or if they thought they could just get them to sign it off, they were very wrong.
Right. Helen Pidd there and Tim Donovan, thank you both very much. With things changing so quickly, if you're confused about what the current COVID restrictions are in your area, you can go to the BBC website, type in your postcode and all the rules will be revealed. Let me give you an example of what happens if you go into Tier 2 and Tier 3. The regional high alert level, or Tier 2, means you must not socialise with anybody outside of your household or support bubble in any indoor setting. The very high alert level, or Tier 3, means you must not socialise with anybody you do not live with at all in any indoor setting or private garden. Now, we also know that Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has proposed a national circuit breaker, which would effectively be a 2 to 3 week mini lockdown, not the same as we experienced in March. Listening to both of those correspondents there and the fact that various parts of the country are moving into the high or very high level, that's certainly being considered. Why do we need a national circuit breaker?
Well, because, one, we've seen it's very confusing. Two, we've seen that these local lockdowns have not yet managed to break the back of the virus. And three, we know that the national testing and tracing system and much of the other national support is not adequate. So what we were proposing is that you actually need to have that circuit breaker restart, get the gains back again that we got in the last lockdown, a shorter period this time, but with the similar or same kind of package of support. And then once you come out of it, you come out of it in the right areas at the right time using the differentiated model.
I mean, I have got one question here, and that question is that we are seeing, significant outbreaks of COVID-19 in certain parts of the country, not the same all over the country. But what I don't know is about how closing down the entire hospitality sector in parts of the country that right now have very low levels of COVID-19 is going to help the situation. How does closing pubs, restaurants and bars in somewhere like Ipswich, where thousands of my constituents are employed in the hospitality sector, but it has low levels of COVID at the moment, how is closing down the entire hospitality sector there going to help us tackle these local outbreaks? Nationalised measures like the one your leader is proposing is not the right way to go at this particular point in time.
Well, you have nationalised measures because you have this bizarre 10 p.m. curfew thing that is not based on science and actually hurts the hospitality sector, doesn't offer them any support. I mean, this is the thing. A national lockdown comes with a package of support.
But the Labour Party is supporting those.
Well, actually, we abstained on those, and backbenchers were given a free vote to vote any way they wanted on the 10 p.m. Actually, because there is great problems with some of those measures. And what Labour has said is that you actually need to restart the button. It's not just a national lockdown for the sake of national lockdown. It's a national lockdown to restart it. So you, at that moment, devolve track and trace down to the local level and get that sorted. Because at the moment, you've only got 60% of people being tracked.
But I still need an answer to the question, which is how is closing down the entire hospitality sector and putting huge numbers of jobs at risk in areas currently with low levels of COVID going to help the situation and going to help us tackle COVID where it is very, very high. There is no answer to that question.
There is an answer because you have national rules that are clear rather than confusing that you have at the moment. You bring it down across the whole of the country because, of course, people can still travel. There are no travel restrictions in these local restrictions. And then you get the country on the same place rather than at the moment what we have is this kind of patchwork approach, which is not working. That's why you do it, because everyone takes the hit, because it is worth it to reset the button.
Right, there is non-essential travel is banned, or certainly the guidance is that for Tier 3. So if that's Liverpool and the Liverpool region. Listening to this, Sonia, if you look at the numbers of people who now find themselves in Tier 2 and Tier 3, so the top two tiers, it's 28.3 million people in England, so over 50% of the population. Are we heading towards a national circuit breaker really by stealth?
Yeah, I think we are heading there. And I think what that discussion about Ipswich missed was that actually, if you're talking about a very time-limited circuit breaker, so people are talking about 2 to 3 weeks, that's a short period of time in which you would close, for example, a sector like hospitality. You would need to put in generous financial support, which this government are not doing. The financial support that's available for Tier 3 does not go far enough to make sure that people do not lose their jobs. And the idea of it is actually that you do it while rates are ticking up but still quite low, because it's at that point that a time-limited circuit breaker can interrupt that process of exponential growth and stop you getting to the sort of situation that we're seeing in Liverpool at the moment, where 95% of ICU beds in Liverpool hospitals are occupied by COVID patients. So what those comments about Ipswich, I think, don't really understand is that when you've got a virus that is growing exponentially, you have to act tough and you have to act early. And by doing that, you can make things quite time limited. The sad truth is, I think, if you look at areas like the Northwest and the Northeast, COVID rates are now so high that it's kind of too late for a circuit breaker to work in those areas. Whereas in an area like London, it may well work for just 2 or 3 weeks at a time. But it is tough politically for the government to introduce tough measures when people don't really feel like things are that bad yet. And that is a real tension at the heart of dealing with a virus that grows exponentially.
I think we've seen from the comments made this week, actually, by senior figures in the World Health Organization, that national lockdown should be absolutely the last resort. The impact they have not just on our livelihoods and our liberties, but also the mental health. And what we're seeing, in terms of people's mental health being impacted by lockdowns as well. So I think it was right. We saw in exchanges yesterday between the Prime Minister and the leader of Her Majesty's opposition that we have an approach which is having a tiered approach that tries to put in place measures that are appropriate for a specific area. This national one-size-fits-all approach, which doesn't have any sensitivity to the level of the virus being at a completely different level in one area to another, is a wrong way forward. And it's difficult to follow because we know.
But Sage say it's the right way forward. So why are you more of an expert than Sage?
Well,
because ultimately you haven't been able to answer that question that I asked you.
Right, well, hang on, Sonia. I'm going to come back to you in a moment. But first of all, you say that it isn't working, but we've only had this tiered approach since yesterday actually in place. Is it worth giving that a chance to see if these restrictions are actually going to have an impact?
We've had a de facto tiered approach in terms of a regional lockdowns now for a number of weeks, and it hasn't worked sufficiently. Sage have looked at this evidence and they've said that it can and it should be considered a short circuit breaker lockdown. In fact, the Prime Minister himself only a month ago was floating this idea in the newspapers, and something made him suddenly change his mind. Not the medical advice, but kind of his political pundits and his friends. And I don't think that's the way that we should be running this country. It should be based on the advice leading. And the advice leading is that a short lockdown might save your constituents in Ipswich, whereas a regional lockdown will probably be too late.
Right, well, let's go to Matthew, because we haven't heard from him for a while. Where are you on this?
Well, I suppose my concern is we are in the eye of the storm, and soon we're going to be stepping back and looking at the broader trends. And if you look at the research on how pandemics shape society over the longer term, Joe, then they seem to suggest that 5 years after a pandemic has hit, overall levels of inequality tend to be significantly higher. The so-called Gini coefficient tends to increase. So all of the decisions that we're making at the moment, I think, have to be taken with an eye on some of that research, where we're likely to see inequalities between high-income and low-income groups. Many of those same inequalities that drove all of the turbulence in the last decade are probably likely to be sharpened by this crisis.
Sonia?
I completely agree with that. And I think that's why there's such an important role for government policy in trying to mitigate the unequal impacts that both COVID has as a disease, but also that social restrictions have. And I don't think this government have done enough of that. But I do think that Tom slightly misrepresented the view of the World Health Organization there in saying that lockdowns are a last resort. They are a last resort in the sense that you want to do everything else you can to try and prevent infection rates ticking up. And for that, you really, really need a functioning test, track and trace system. Unfortunately, the government has wasted the summer. It's completely bungled it. We know contact rates are too low. We know there are massive problems with testing. What the World Health Organization didn't mean, however, is that once you've got the virus ticking up exponentially, you don't use a lockdown as a last resort, because at that point it's too late. And the problem is that the later you leave it, the tougher restrictions have to be. So if you act swiftly and quickly, perhaps when people feel like things aren't that bad yet, that prevents you from taking tougher action later on. And if we want to keep our schools open, for example, it's really, really important to take action now. And on the mental health point, that is so important. But the question I would ask government is, you've had a whole summer to prepare for this. Why haven't you been investing more in mental health services, in online therapeutic support to help people cope with the impacts of the fluctuating social restrictions that scientists were saying that we were going to be living with for months, right at the very start of this pandemic? They've wasted the summer.
All right, let's refer to David Nabarro, because this is the guy from the World Health Organization, and what he did actually say, which is, by and large, we don't want to go for lockdowns because they make people poorer. There will be context to that, but just responding to some of the things that Sonia said. I think that the key point here is, the Prime Minister is in this very difficult position where he needs to balance protecting people's lives but also their livelihoods as well. And actually, they're not completely disconnected. And I think when you're dealing with a situation where we've already taken the huge hit that we've taken, and I think the sad thing is, if you close down our entire hospitality sector, some of those businesses just won't reopen again. And that would be, and the long-term impact of that on our health and well-being and the future of this country would be devastating. So I agree with Will. Hang on, Sonia. Hang on, Sonia. I'm just going to go to Lloyd, because one of the questions people might be wanting to know is the circuit breaker. What would be different with a national circuit breaker in terms of what people can and can't do to Tier 3, for example?
Well, I would imagine the national circuit breaker restrictions would be much more like the lockdown restrictions, where it wouldn't last as long, but it would be much more about saying, stay at home unless you have to get food, exercise, you have essential work, or you can't do your work from home, and you've got medical issues. And that would allow, at that moment, to sort out the test and tracing, which
let's talk about test and trace.
Bungled.
You brought it up. Let's talk about test and trace. Paul Waugh from the HuffPost has tweeted this, because the figures are out today. Latest test and trace statistics. Another record low in contact tracing. Taking into account all contacts identified, just 62.6% were reached. It was 68% the week before. 89,874 people tested positive for coronavirus, COVID-19, between the 1st of October and the 7th of October. That's a rise of 64% on the week before. It's pretty low, isn't it?
Well, my experience of test and trace is quite significant, bearing in mind that I only came out of self-isolation a couple of days ago.
That's your experience. Look at those figures. They're dropping.
But I would say that if you look at the number of people we're testing every day compared with other major European countries, I think a huge amount of work has gone into this. It's not a perfect system right now, but it's a huge challenge. And I think, by and large, I don't think we're in a bad place. I think there's some improvements that need to be made. I think in terms of trying to, where possible, get more cooperation from local partners, I think isn't a bad idea to explore. And there's been some examples, I think, in Cumbria where it's worked quite well. And I think the government, is open to that.
Right. Would you like to see more of a move to local health authorities having more control over test and trace?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a level of national coordination. But I think if we can get that cooperation from local partners, and if that's proven to work, then I think it's worth being open to that.
Right, Matthew, it's not working as well as it should by any stretch. It's going in the wrong direction in terms of the figures when they come out.
Well, as the other guest just said, it's not a perfect system. And I can tell you, within the context of higher education, we're going through our own crisis at the moment in terms of various universities and colleagues trying to apply this system to the university population, which in some cases has been pretty disastrous, actually. We've seen fairly prominent spokespersons sort of act as if the increase in cases on campus has been a surprise when we knew that that increase was coming all along. And I think more generally, there's just a lack of strategic long-term thinking going into this and how it's affecting institutions. And of course, in all fairness, I suppose to the government is, the magnitude of this crisis is so great, no matter whether it's a Conservative government, a Labour government, no matter whether it's the UK or any other country around the world, everybody's struggling, I think, with it. But there does seem to be a sort of systemic issue that's going wrong, in particular in this country at the moment.
OK, well, picking up on that point, this is a massive job. Any government would struggle.
Yes, but we are struggling worse than most other governments in Europe in terms of the tracking and tracing. I have university labs to start with that are empty. My university, Bournemouth University, they asked in March if they could convert their labs to do testing. They said that they had the capacity there. The government did not pick them up on that because they were obsessed with going to their private friends. Their private friends have bungled this, lost huge amounts of money, and are not tracing properly. And we see in other areas where it's run by the state, whether it's Wales or whether it's in Germany, for example, where it's run by local authorities, they're able to hit targets of something like 80 to 90% of testing. And I've got one example of a constituent. Her friends, her daughter got positive. She gave the list of numbers of all the people that they'd been contacted with. Locally, we know where they all are. And of course, she has privately informed them. 2 weeks later, none of them, not one of them, got a phone call or a trace. And we followed that up. We know that that's the fact. And that is because the system has fundamentally failed. Whereas if it was done locally, we would have had someone going around from the council, knocking on their door, making sure it was implemented, keeping people safe.
I don't completely disagree with all of the comments you just made there, and I've made my point about local input. But what I would say is we do hear rightly about the stories where it doesn't work right, but what we don't hear about
40%
are the huge number of occasions where it does work right. But and Matthew said it as well, the unprecedented challenge this government currently faces dealing with this very difficult to deal with crisis. And it would be good if a leader of Her Majesty's opposition would actually work with the Prime Minister in a constructive way. He promised he would do, but now we have the Shadow Education Secretary saying this is a good opportunity, this is a good crisis to exploit.
That was a little while ago.
It was a little while ago, but she remains the Shadow Education Secretary when she should have resigned because of that comment. I think it was unforgivable.
Keir has written repeatedly to the Prime Minister, offering support on schools and other issues, bringing people around the table. And the Prime Minister has refused either to respond. I wrote to the Prime Minister around involving fire services in this. The Prime Minister still didn't properly respond to me. The Prime Minister, I'm afraid, has been absolutely absent in leadership in this. And we see other countries and other governments, they manage to do it, don't they? This is a global issue, and our government's failing.
Final word, Tom, and then we're moving on.
So your leader says he supports the rule of six, he abstains on the rule of six. He flip-flops and his position changes from one day to the next. He hasn't been constructive. He called a Prime Minister an opportunist. Yes. Sir Keir Starmer is the opportunist here.
All right, on that note, we're going to move on because we're going to talk about something completely different, about whether we need to do more to protect children from unregulated beauty treatments. And just to warn you, if you're having lunch, you might want to look away, certainly at the beginning.
There was a very obvious head on my lip and it was this side and it was so swollen. And I literally looked at myself in the mirror and I thought, that's not right. And I squeezed it, like really just gently. And it literally just exploded with green, yellow pus. It was the most vile thing.
After a friend got her lips done, Helen Busby decided to do it too. Fuller lips, she said, would really help her self-esteem. But it didn't go to plan.
It was the following weekend then where the other side then flared up. And I thought, oh gosh, this is going to happen again. And unfortunately, it for me, because the pressure itself was so painful. I couldn't eat properly. I had to drink through a straw.
If you tap into social media, you'll see thousands of adverts offering fillers and lip treatments. Most of these people are legit. But here's the thing. You don't need any health or medical qualifications to set yourself up as a practitioner. In fact, you don't need any qualifications at all. And you can buy the stuff online and off you go.
The problems with dermal fillers are vast and the range of complications are also very serious, and they can range from blindness, permanent tissue death, infection, swelling and a whole host of other really unsightly complications.
Ashton Collins runs Save Face, a charity that campaigns to make these sort of procedures safer.
Hi.
Hi Ashton, how are you?
Yes, I'm very good, thank you. Most dermal fillers are made of something called hyaluronic acid, and hyaluronic acid is produced by the body naturally, and as we grow older, we lose that. So the dermal filler is made of a sort of a synthetic version of that, and it can be used to augment. So you can most commonly use to plump the lips or the cheeks, but it can also be used to smooth out fine lines and wrinkles. And in the right hands, it's very safe and effective. So bizarre that you can't get a tattoo unless you're 18, but you can have something that could potentially blind you or disfigure you for life. And it's outrageous.
The Tory MP Laura Trott is pushing for a change in the law to ban under 18s from getting both fillers and Botox.
No child needs cosmetic Botox or fillers. And it's something that I came across talking to a number of charities, including Save Face in the area, other MPs. And I just heard these horrendous case studies of mainly girls, as young as 15, who had absolutely awful procedures being carried out by unlicensed, unscrupulous professionals. People can't believe that this is legal currently, which is why I think it's got cross-party backing, and I'm hoping that it'll progress as we go through the House of Commons.
I was lucky. I caught the infection in time, I had it removed, and yes, there is small effects to my lips the way they are now, but at the time I was so, wow, this is, something that's going to solve all these self-confidence issues that I've got, and it's so easy to get hold of, and of course it's going to work because everyone else has it. Unfortunately, that just wasn't the case for me, and I feel really stupid for it.
That report by Ellie Price. Sonia, you've written about this issue. I mean, people, I think, will be shocked. I was shocked to find out that anyone can set themselves up to administer these treatments without qualifications.
Yeah, it's absolutely shocking, isn't it? And there's no age limit on it. We know the pressures that there are on young men and young women to sort of, improve their physical appearance on social media, and they can just go and get these treatments and there's no regulation of them whatsoever. I was really shocked when I wrote about it a couple of years ago. I hadn't realised how unregulated this is. There have been numerous sort of reviews of this, independent reviews, that have called for much tighter regulation of cosmetic treatments like these, because they can do you permanent damage, but we've not seen any action. So I completely back what Laura Trott's trying to do here, and I hope it's something that the government takes seriously and that they actually move forward into legislation. It would be about sort of 15 years too late in my book.
Right, but Matt, people might also be surprised to hear that it's actually reliant on a private member's bill to actually make it illegal for under 18s to go and get these treatments, which are quite often botched. Shouldn't the government be taking this on board?
Was that for me, Jo?
Yes, it was, Matt. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to ask ourselves why is this happening in the first place? And it's great that Sonia and Laura are drawing attention to it. And I think it really speaks to a cultural problem that we have. It's not only that children are wanting to do this, but it's also more generally reflected in a massive mental health crisis that we have, in particular among young girls. There's now a large research literature on what's called PSU, which is problematic smartphone usage. We now have lots of research showing that the young Zoomers who are walking into my lecture theatres and seminars, in some cases are more sociable than the slightly older millennials, but they're also statistically more likely to suffer from a range of problems, including loneliness, mental health issues. And I think, for me, this is speaking to the broader problem that we have, which, to be blunt, is the sexualization of our children. We have no guardrails within society anymore as we've become hyper individualistic. We've given everybody as much choice as they want in as many spheres of life as they want. And this is another consequence of that, which is children beginning to consider that plastic surgery and Botox and dermal fillers is a legitimate, completely reasonable choice to make. And I think the deeper problem is the one that we really need to get to be honest.
Right. Is it a deeper problem, a wider problem, Sonia?
Yes, I think I would agree with what Matt said, but I also think that there's a broader societal issue, which is expectations around the way that women look and around ageing. So, there have been lots but I also think we need to take a deeper look on ourselves as a society and ask ourselves why we sort of find ageing, particularly when it comes to women, why we sort of find it so problematic and why it seems to be something that some people recoil from. Because unless we tackle those deep-seated issues as well, that women are always going to feel like that there's pressure on them to look younger.
Right. Tom, will you back it, this private member's bill?
Well, I have to say that documentary is very useful, and I think I will, because I think Laura is a very talented MP from my intake, and I think she's doing great work there. And that's one of the benefits of private members' bills, because you can pick up and really focus on these issues that often haven't got the attention that they deserve. And I think this is an important issue.
And the law should change?
I think it should do, from what I've seen there. Yeah.
Will you back it?
Yes, I mean, if it comes to a vote, very often these things are filibustered out or they're just timetabled out. I don't quite understand why it needs a private member's bill, because this should just be about the regulation of medical grade goods. That can happen by a ministerial direction or statutory instrument, and that's actually where this should be dealt with immediately. They should be treated as medical goods that require a medical practitioner to deal with them. And yes, there might be some medical reasons for under 18s, but broadly it should be very much restricted. I mean, I don't understand actually why anyone needs it particularly. I think actually growing older should be something that we celebrate, and you have so many people that look so beautiful actually as their faces grow older.
I agree. I agree, Lloyd.
Kind of baby faces that can often look pretty unpleasant.
But in the meantime, you'll probably back it if it comes
if
to
it comes, I will, yeah.
All right, let's talk about something completely different. I want to show our guests and our viewers this graph. Pupil progress through secondary school in England. It's actually about working class boys in different ethnic groups and how they progress through secondary school in England. These are figures from the Department for Education showing Progress 8 scores, which is whether pupils have made progress from the ages of 11 to 16. And if you have a look at the top, the 0.76, but plus 0.76, Chinese boys progressing at the highest level in those different groups, and white working class boys, those eligible for free school meals, are on minus 0.98 at the very bottom with a very low score. Tom, is this an issue in your constituency?
It is. I mean, but there are lots of pupils who fall into that category, sadly, and I think that I was actually on the Education Select Committee this week where Matthew was presenting evidence, and as a committee we're going to look at all disadvantaged groups, and that must include pupils from white pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. It must include them as well. There's no reason why it shouldn't. Right.
Why do you think they're being left behind in that way?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why we're honing in on it, because the stats are eye-opening as to why that's the case. But I think one of the things that Matthew spoke about at the Select Committee was we're often talking about children from very disadvantaged backgrounds who have already got that to challenge with, and I think there's been this sense somehow that we can't look at this issue, and you have this term white privilege that has come into public discourse, and you tell that to some of the young boys and girls in my constituency who come from those low income backgrounds. I think it's a very divisive term, white privilege, and I think we should be very careful when it's used.
And we're going to talk about white privilege in this discussion. But first of all, Lloyd, should there be more focus on that figure of minus 0.98 for white working class boys?
I mean, that figure was not necessarily determined working class. I think that figure was just
on free school meals,
on race and free school meals. There is clearly a problem, and I remember when I was on the board at Bradford University over 10 years ago now, a university, of course, in a very multicultural city. 50% of our students came from a Muslim or Islamic background. And one of the big issues that we were tackling with why weren't more local white working class boys, particularly, coming to the university. And so this is a long-running discussion. And I do think in those frameworks, in the framework of education, talking about white privilege is probably not a very helpful thing. Is it right for me to determine what people should use in terms of talking about an historic context, talking about the context of oppression? No, it's not right for me to shut down terms, but I do think it's probably an unhelpful term in this context of education that we're talking about now.
Just very, very quickly. So I think one of the things is often I think some of these people, when they look at university, they don't necessarily see it as a vehicle for progress. And I think there's been a problem with our education system which hasn't had enough of an emphasis on technical and apprenticeships as well as higher education. Yeah. And I think ultimately if there was more of a roadmap for them to aspire towards, I think inevitably you'd see improvements in terms of academic attainment along the way.
Right, well, Tom mentioned that you talked about this and the term white privilege, Matt, when you were in front of, I should say, the Education Select Committee. I'm just showing everybody this in the Times. Don't ask working class boys to apologise for white privilege, experts warn. What were you talking about?
Well, I actually didn't bring white privilege up in the committee, Joe. I was asked about white privilege by a Labour MP, and I was slightly taken aback because, in a sense, this issue is really not about white privilege. This issue is about the underlying social and economic factors that are holding these kids back. And it's not only that they're at the bottom of the pile, eclipsed only by children from Gypsy, Roma and Irish traveller families, but it's also that they've made much less progress over the last 10 years than other groups in society. So in one sense, I would suggest this is partly a success story for some groups in society. Chinese kids, Black African, Black Caribbean kids have made remarkable progress over the last 10 years. But there is something unique and specific to this group that's holding them back. And my suggestion in reply to the Labour MP was to simply say that our national conversation is changing. The last 6 months has really shown that as we've gone through the protests and so forth. And ideas like toxic masculinity, white privilege are now part of our mainstream discussion, and I hear them regularly on university campus, for example, Joe. But they are, I would suggest, incredibly unhelpful terms when we're thinking through some of these social issues. And if anything, they, I think, compound a sense among this group, not only that they are being left behind relative to others, we can go into that in more detail if you like, but also that they should feel bad about who they are. And the last thing I think these kids really need is another reason to feel bad about who they are.
Sonia?
Well, I don't think we need to worry about white privilege being taught in schools up and down the country, because I just don't think it is at all, actually. I think it is a debate that's sort of going on in universities and other spaces. But I agree there's a real issue around the progress and attainment of white working class boys. There is also amongst other low-income groups. For example, you know, if we look at black boys, they may be doing better than black working class boys may be doing better than white working class boys when it comes to progressing on to university. But we know that young black men suffer some of the worst employment outcomes in the labour market, for example. So it's really important not to seeing this as pitting one group against another. It's really rich, though, I think, to hear Tom talking about the issues for working class kids, poor working class kids, because he's part of a government, a Conservative Party that has failed working class young people and children over the last 10 years. So they're outside of London. Your chances of going to a poorly performing school, not a good or outstanding school, if you're working class or poor, are far, far higher than if you come from a much more privileged background. That is true regardless of your ethnicity outside of London. We've seen Sure Start centres, children's centres cut, slashed, hundreds closed across the country. We see a system in which the government spends much more on young people who go to university than young people who don't, and that has not changed in the last decade. And we're seeing rising child poverty and huge cuts to benefits that have left working class kids, really left out in the cold.
Let me let Tom respond, because we haven't got that long.
I think this is a specific point about why one low-income group is doing much worse than other low-income groups. So I think just to blame austerity, I don't think is an appropriate response. I do think there's a point here about university and the lack of focus on apprenticeships and technical education. And actually it was the previous Labour government who had this obsession with the 50% target for university places, which I think in some ways may have been quite damaging to these young children that we're talking about, who may not necessarily want to go down that route.
It was your government that got rid of the EMA. It was your government that's trashed further education. So come on, let's not pretend that this is some Labour government. We've had 10 years of absolute disaster in education policy, all about testing, not allowing people to show their practical skills. The Gove reforms of education have helped contribute to this.
One group.
All right.
Let's go back, because other ways of learning.
I just want to look at the issue that we are discussing here, which is pitting groups against each other, which is what all the panellists have talked about. Is it helpful to focus too much on different types of identity, be it race, class, gender or sexuality?
Well, I think you have to have an understanding of how different things interact with each other. Is it useful for someone to come along and put you or me or anyone in a box of you are this, so you must be that? that totally obliterates any personal stories that people have gone through, any ideas of intersectionality, of the different things contributing together. So is that helpful to put people in boxes because of it? No. Is it helpful for us to try and explore different ideas in an academic and policy-making framework? Of course. What I would say is I think it's very dangerous to suggest talking about race and white privilege is the same as about talking about toxic masculinity. I think they are different things.
Well, let me put that back to Matthew.
Well, if you don't think that these kids are reading these ideas, then I'd encourage you to go and look at the Amazon bestseller chart of what they're seeing in their Instagram feeds. The idea that school children are not being exposed to these ideas is nonsense. And it's very depressing to see this issue reduced to politics and who did what during government. The blunt reality is everybody failed for these kids, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem. Looking at the statistics over the last few weeks as I was preparing to give evidence was one of the most depressing experiences in my professional career. I think everybody needs to actually come together and think about how we can keep good teachers in disadvantaged areas, how we can build up apprenticeships and technical training, and a lot of other things that lots of people have been suggesting for over 10 years.
All right, I'm going to cut you short because we've come to the end of the show, but thank you to all of my guests from all of us here. Bye-bye.